Okay, guys, we're finishing out 10.6b. We're starting on page 626, and we're classifying conic sections, but then we're also going to write and graph them once we've classified, meaning they're not going to tell you, hey, let's graph this hyperbola, or hey, let's write the equation for the hyperbola like we did yesterday. Okay, now they're just going to give us this huge equation, and they're going to say, you decide what it is, you get it in the right form, and you graph it. So they give us this little helper, they give us this box, and it's based on the discriminant, which we used discriminant back in chapter 5 when we were doing quadratic formula, that b squared minus 4ac. Now it told us something a little bit different back then. It told us how many solutions that equation would have. Today it's telling us, is it going to be a hyperbola, an ellipse, a parabola, a circle? Okay, and you guys should have filled that table out to tell you these things, okay? All right, so the first thing we're going to do is look at example 6. And example 6 gives us 2x squared plus y squared minus 4x minus 4 equals 0. The first thing we have to do is classify it. Now, b is always with xy, a is always with x squared, and c is always with y squared. All those other things do not matter for discriminant. So if you look at the equation you have here, you don't have an xy term, so b is 0. A, remember, is always with x squared, so that's 2. And c is always with y squared, so that's 1. So that gives me 0 minus 8 or negative 8. Now, if you look at your table, you have two choices when your discriminant is less than 0. You know that it's either a circle or an ellipse. Well, for a circle, b had to be 0 and a had to be equal c. Well, yeah, b is 0, but our a and c did not equal each other, so it can't be a circle. An ellipse says that either b cannot be 0 or a cannot equal c. Well, obviously, our a did not equal our c, so this is an ellipse. Now, on the first part of your homework, this is all you do. You're done. You stop. You classified the conic. You knew that this equation would produce you an ellipse. You're done, okay? That's all you have to do in the first part of your homework when it says classify. But if you take a look, if you notice at the bottom of your homework, those bottom problems, yes, they want you to classify it, but then you have to write it and then you have to graph it. So I'm going to go ahead and do this so that you have an example of how to write and graph an ellipse from here. So we're basically just going to start over. And if you notice that on example 6, it says graph the equation in part A. Well, you can't graph it until you write it. So in your notes, it says graphing the equation once it's classified. That's what we're going to do right now. The first thing says set the equation equal to 0. Ours is equal to 0, so we're good. Then it says group the x's and y's together, meaning this guy needs to be over with his partner. So we've got 2x squared minus 4x plus y squared minus 4 equals 0. Then it says complete the square for the squared terms only. All right, if you're forgetting how to complete the square completely, you can go back to section 5.5, and we did this in quadratic equations. It's a little bit looser than what we're going to do today, all right? So it's not going to be exactly like that, but it does follow that basic form. I did give you some helpers in your notes. The first thing says move the constant to the right-hand side, okay? So we're going to move this guy over. Oops, moving him over. All right, and then it says the leading coefficients of the squared terms must be 1. Okay, well, this guy is a square and this guy is a square. His leading coefficient must be 1, and I should have grouped these guys together. Grouped the x's. Obviously, he doesn't have anybody to group together, so I'm going to leave him alone. Okay, since he doesn't have a leading coefficient of 1, I need to take that out. So I'm going to pull that out to the front. So it's kind of like I factored it. Everybody else gets to be left alone because y squared had a coefficient of 1. He was okay. Then it says, take half of the x or the y term and square it. Now remember, because we have an x squared and a y squared, we're technically completing the square for both of these guys, okay? So we're going to have to take half of the x term and half of the y term and square that and add that to both sides. So if you take a look at your x term, we have 2 divided by 2 squared would have been negative 2 divided by 2 is negative 1, squared is 1. And I'm supposed to add this to both sides. But remember, I'm going to squeeze him in right there. Remember what I took out? I took out a 2, okay? So yes, I can put 1 in right here. But to actually add him to the other side with 4, I have to think about what I did to that. Meaning this has got to be 2 times that 1 because of this guy right here, okay? Now, I need to complete the square for this guy as well, but he doesn't have a plain old y term like he did, meaning that's just going to be 0 divided by 2 squared. Well, that's 0, so no sense in even worrying about him. Let's just bring down that y squared. Okay? Next step says to factor, meaning I need to factor this piece, and I would have factored him if he would have had a y term, meaning a plain old y term. This is a perfect square trinomial, so he factors to x minus 1 quantity squared. And this would be 4 plus 2, which is 6. Now notice I'm starting to look like an ellipse because I definitely have a plus sign, and I definitely have some quantity squareds here. Even if this guy, that could be changed to y minus 0 quantity squared. So how do I have to finish that off? Because in our notes it says, get in the classified conics standard form. And if you think about an ellipse, it has to be equal to 1, and I should have some denominators. I can't have coefficients, okay? So first off, let's divide by this 6 so that I can get a 1, and everybody's going to be divided by it. 2 over 6 reduces to 1/3. That got rid of my coefficient. Awesome. And now it's equal to 1. Perfect. So there's my equation. It's in ellipse form. It's in x minus h squared over, which one would this be? This would actually be b squared plus y squared over a squared, because remember in an ellipse, a is always the bigger term, meaning if you look back at your box, this one is going to open vertically. It's going to be like a hot dog shape. So now we'll go back to our notes from yesterday, and we're going to graph that ellipse with the vertical axis. So it says, determine the direction. We already did that. Plot the center. The center is going to be HK. So in our case, it will be 1. We don't have a K here, so that's 0. I'm going to have to do an itty-bitty graph. Sorry. That's just my center, so I'm going to use a star. Then it says use A and B to plot the vertices and the co-vertices. Remember, 6 is my A squared. So that means A is, take the square root of that guy, 2.45. B squared is 3. So that means B is 1.73. So from the center, remember we know this opens up or down. It should look like a hot dog. So I'm going to go up 2.45, down 2.45. Then I'm going to go out 1.73 and left 1.73. Oh, and I almost forgot my focus, but I'm not going to this time. I need to use foci formula. So that for an ellipse is c squared equals a squared minus b squared. So in our case, that would be 6 minus 3. So c squared equals 3. So we know c from over here would be 1.73. So if I go up 1.73 and down 1.73, there's my graph. Okay, so let's go through that again. I had to determine that it was an ellipse first by using b squared minus 4ac. B goes with xy. We didn't have an xy term. A goes with x squared, and c goes with y squared. That gave me this. I knew it was an ellipse because A and C were not the same. Then once I determined it was an ellipse, once I classified it, I needed to get it in its standard form. Okay, so I had to complete the square. I moved the constant to the right-hand side. I got rid of a leading coefficient there. I took half of the middle term and squared it. Remember, I didn't have to do that here because it was just 0. If he would have had a y term, I would have, and I would have added him to the right-hand side as well. Okay, I factored. That gave me this. Then once I got to this point, it was getting very close to being in ellipse form. I know ellipse form has to be equal to 1, so I divided everything by 6. That got rid of that coefficient. So now I had my pretty equation. Then I determined, so now that I need to graph it, I need to know what it looks like. Is it a hamburger or a hot dog form? This one's a hot dog opening up and down because this is bigger, so a squared would be here. My vertex, or sorry, my center was 1, 0, because he doesn't have a plain old k with him. My a was square root of 6. My b was square root of 3. Then I used that to find c for my focus. Okay, let's do another one of those. Example 7. A lot of stuff here, guys, but I know you can do it. All right, example 7 gives us 4x squared minus 9y squared plus 32x minus 144y minus 548 equals 0. Okay, first thing I need to do is classify it. So I need to do b squared minus 4ac. Okay, remember b is always with xy. I don't have an xy term here, so that's 0. A is always with x, so that's 4. C is always with y squared. I think I said that wrong just a little bit ago. A is always with x squared, so that's 4. If I said that wrong, sorry. C is always with y squared, so that's negative 9. 0 squared is 0. 4 times 4 is 16. Times 9 is 144, and it would be a positive 144. So that would be 144. Now if I look at my table, that number is obviously greater than 0. So that tells me this is a hyperbola. Now remember, on the first part of your homework, this is all you have to do. You just have to classify it, okay? The second part of your homework wants you to classify it and go further. So I'm going to take this further. But on the first part of your homework, all you have to do is classify it, okay? If you notice, example 7 wants us to graph it. So we have to write it first, and then we can graph it. So we're going to start all the way over. Okay, and we're looking at our notes, the same notes, graphing the equation once it's classified. So it says set it equal to 0. Done. Get your x's and your y's together, okay? So we need to do a little bit of rearranging. You're not using inverse operations here, guys. You're just moving some terms around. They're still all on the left-hand side. So I got my x's together. I got my y's together. And then I have my plain old constant. Okay? Step 3 says, step 4, because we're completing the square for the squared terms only. Well, we have 2 squared, so we're going to have to complete the square twice. We need to get that constant to the other side. And we need our leading coefficients to be 1. So that means I need to take 4 out of this one. And to get a leading coefficient here, notice I grouped the negative. I want to take out a negative 9. That gives me y squared, oh, I should have known that, plus 16. And then I'm moving that constant to the other side. All right. Then it says take half of the x and or the y term and square it. Remember, I have to do it for both of these guys. So I'm going to have to take half of this guy and square it, take half of this guy and square it, and then add them to both sides. So I've got 8 divided by 2 squared is going to give me 4, is going to give me 16. But remember, I took that 4 out, so I'm actually on this side adding 4 times 16. Okay, because technically that's what I'm adding here as well. Notice that 16 is in parentheses. Then I'm going to do the same thing here. 16 divided by 2 squared, that's 8 squared is 64. Going to add that to both sides. Technically on that right, oops, should have been an equal sign. I'm running out of room here. So I've got 4 times 16, but now I've got negative 9 times 64. Then I'm bringing to that side too. Okay. Now I need to factor. I need to factor both these parts because I'm completing both of these squares. So this is going to factor to 4x plus 4 squared. Remember, it's a perfect square trinomial. This is going to factor to y plus 8 squared. And then on this side, I have, I'm just going to do all of it at once. Ah, shoot, I keep typing the wrong thing in. I get 36 on that right-hand side when I clean all of that up. Okay, so I'm getting close to being a hyperbola because you can see I have 2 quantity squareds. You can see I have subtraction in the middle, which I need for a hyperbola, but a hyperbola has to be equal to 1. So we're ready for step 7 that says get that guy in classified form, okay, or in that classified conic section standard form. So let's divide this by 36. Remember, everybody gets divided by 36. Now just reduce those fractions. That would be 1/9. This would be 1/4. And this would be 1. Now I'm in standard form. X minus h squared over a squared minus y minus k squared over b squared equals 1. Now, since we know it's a hyperbola, guys, and we see that x is first, we know from the start that that is a right and left hyperbola, meaning it follows the horizontal axis. Okay, so when I'm ready to graph it, I'm looking at hyperbola notes. It says determine the direction of the graph. We already did that. Plot the center. Remember, center is HK. So in my case, this would be -4, -8. And I'm going to have to do it over here. Center is not actually on my graph, remember. Use A and B to plot the vertices and the co-vertices. A here, this is A squared. That means A is 3. B squared is here. That means B is 2. Remember, it's going left and right. So that means A has to go left and right. So we've got 1, 2, 3. We've got 1, 2, 3. And then we need to go up 2 and down 2. Then we're supposed to draw our box and our asymptotes. And we need our focus. I'm not going to forget this time. Foci formula is c squared equals a squared plus b squared. So our a is 9, or our a squared is 9, and our b squared is 4. That gives me c squared is 13, or 3.61. So Remember, it was a right or left one, so 1, 2, 3.61 would be right here, very close to, very close to that vertex. Okay, there's my final. So you needed this equation and you needed this graph. All right, so there's an example of a hyperbola. Let's look at number 8. Okay, number 8 gives me x squared plus 2x minus 4y plus 4 equals 0. I'm supposed to be doing b squared minus 4ac. Got to classify it first. Remember, b is always with xy. There's not an xy term, so that's 0. A is always with x squared. His coefficient is 1. C is always with y squared. I don't have a y squared, so that's 0. So that's going to give me 0 minus 4 times 1 times 0 is 0. So my discriminant is 0. And if you look at your box, if your discriminant equals 0, that's a parabola. Okay? So if you were doing the first part of your homework, the first part of your homework just says classify. I would be done. That's all they want me to do is just classify. I'm done. Okay? If you were doing the second part of your homework, remember you have to write and graph. So we've got to go further than this. So we're going to start over. Now that we know it's a parabola, we wanted to put it in parabola form. So we're looking at graphing the equation once it's classified. It says set it equal to 0. It is. Group your x's and your y's together. Okay, well my x's are already together. And my y, there's only one of those, and there's my constant. It says complete the square for the squared term only. He's my only squared term, meaning I'm only going to complete the square for the x's because notice I don't have a y squared this time. I don't have to worry about him. Okay, so he's just going to hang out while the other guys do the work. Number 4 says move the constant to the right-hand side and make sure your squared term's leading coefficient is 1. Squared term's leading coefficient is 1, so I don't have to worry about taking anything out. I need to get that constant to the other side, though. Okay. Now it says take half of the x and or y term and square it. Remember, we're only completing the square for this guy, so I don't have to worry about him since he didn't have a y squared. So I only have to do 2 divided by 2 squared. That's 1. So I'm going to add that to this guy. And then I've got to add it to the right-hand side too. Notice I didn't have to multiply him by anything because I didn't take anything out this time. Then I'm supposed to factor this. Perfect square trinomial. It's -3. I'm starting to look like a parabola form because I have this quantity squared. So then it says, get in classified conics standard form. Remember the standard form has that quantity squared on the left-hand side and everything else is on the right-hand side? So let's move this guy to the right-hand side. Okay, we're getting closer. But if you take a look at that, in your parabola standard form, it has that 4p times the quantity of something else, meaning I need a parenthesis over there or something. It's not looking right. So what I have to do is I have to take something out of both of those terms so that y has a coefficient of 1. Well, obviously, I'm going to take 4 out. 3 divided by 4 is 3/4. Now I have my standard form because I have x minus h quantity squared equals 4p times the quantity of y minus k. All right, now we need to graph it. Okay, well, we know it starts with an x, so that tells me in parabola form that it's got to open up or down. Then if you look at your notes, the next thing we need to do is plot the vertex. Remember, vertex is hk. So in this case, it would be -1, +3/4. They're opposite of what it looks like. Then it says, find P and plot the focus. So we set that 4 equal to 4P. Well, that's an easy one. P equals 1. It's a +1, and this is supposed to open either up or down. Since it's a positive, it's going to open up. So I go up one spot. There's my focus. Swallow it up. There's my graph. So there's an example of a parabola. Last one. Need to have an example of a circle. Let's see if we can find one. Look at number 10. Number 10 gives me x squared plus y squared plus 7x minus 4y minus 8 equals 0. I've got to classify it first, so I've got to do b squared minus 4ac. B is with xy. I don't have an xy term, so that's 0. A is with x squared. His coefficient is 1. C is with y squared, so his coefficient is 1. That would give me 0 minus 4 or -4. Now remember, when it's less than 0, I have two options. It's either a circle or an ellipse, but B is 0 and A is equal to C. So that tells me that's a circle. Because remember, for an ellipse, it was either or. Either B could be 0 or A could be C. A and C could be equal. We have both, so that tells me it's a circle. Okay, now remember, if I was just classifying, I would be done. But we're going to practice writing and graphing as well, so you're ready for that second part of your homework. So you're going to start all the way over again. And you're going to complete the square. It says set it equal to 0. We've got it. Group your x's and your y's together. Okay, so we need to kind of move these guys around, just rearrange a little bit. It says I'm supposed to be completing the square for the squared terms only. Notice I have 2, so I'm going to have to complete the square twice for this one. It says move the constant to the right-hand side and make sure my leading coefficients are 1. Well, my leading coefficients are good, but I need this constant to be on the other side. Now I'm ready to take half of the x term and half of the y term and square it. So I've got 7 over 2 squared. That would be, I can't reduce that. And if I square the top and the bottom, that would be 49/4. Add that to both sides. Now remember, I didn't take anything out here, so it's easy to add it to this side. I don't have to multiply it by anything like I had to in the first couple examples. Then I'm going to do the same thing here. -4 divided by 2 squared. That gives me +4. And add him to the other side. Again, I didn't have to multiply him by anything because I didn't take anything out up here. Now I'm ready to factor. Perfect square trinomial here. Square root of that is 7/2. And 2. And if I add these up, that would be 12. That'd be 48/4. So that'd be 97/4. But let me check. Oh, that was awesome. Mrs. Holloway just did that in her head. Okay. Now, you can see this looks like a circle. I don't have to do anything more than this. X minus h squared plus y minus k squared equals r squared. I'm done. Okay, this is okay. So there's my equation. I don't have to rearrange him like I did the ellipse or the hyperbola or the parabola, because remember, for the ellipse and the hyperbola, they had to equal 1 and they needed some denominators. For the parabola, you could only have the quantity squared on one side, and then you needed to factor out something so that your other side had a coefficient of 1. Okay, circle is good. Once you factor, you're ready to rock. So now we look at our notes for factoring or for graphing a circle. It says plot the center. My center is HK. Remember, guys, 7 halves, that's just negative 3.5. Or sorry, yeah, negative 3.5 because it's opposite of what it looks like. 2. There's my center. And my radius, what's the square root of 97/4? That, unfortunately, I can't do in my head. About 4.9. So here's my center at negative 3.5, 2. And then I'm going to go right 4.9, up 4.9, left 4.9, and down 4.9. Oh my. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, almost to 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, almost to 5. 1, 2, 3, 4. Running out of room. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, almost to 5. There's my circle. So I classified it, I found my equation, and I graphed it. Okay? All right, do your best. Good luck.